So we're going to run this podcast like we did the third class with a 3-act play structure. So first act is to sell or not to sell. And we'll discuss that. Second act is go to market. And the third is crossing the finish line. So with regard to selling or not selling, what are some of the drivers and why would you sell your business? And I'll give a few examples here, Chris and or Peter, to remark on. For example, right now in the IT space, and in particular digital transformation and services, the market is absolutely on fire, frothy beyond frothy. So this would be a very good time to sell if you choose to do so. Another reason why you might sell your business is to just take some chips off the table, so to speak. This means banking some cash and stock for future, use, but you continue to keep working. So, and then another reason, just very simply, is you might want to do something else. You're tired of being the space you're in. You want to do something new. Sometimes it might be tax related. You expect tax rates to go down or up, and those might prompt you to make some changes. And the last and obvious one is retirement and transitioning. So Chris, can you talk about your prior experiences really with selling a business yourself?
Sure, Casey. Yeah, I've gone through this a few times, actually. The first when I was a real young lad, at the dawn of the internet, if you will. Had a small email-based business known as MailStart, and we were approached pretty much right as we were in our growth phase by a company that was offering us a reverse merger. In today's world, we think of those as the SPAC companies, the special purpose acquisition companies. And in essence, they came to us and liked the customer base that we had, and the stage of growth that our company was at was we were looking for investors in capitalization. And so what led us to that first sale was getting the monies that we needed to get that capitalization that we wanted to be able to move us into the next level. The most recent sale that I went through, which was back in 2016 through 2017, was with the ECATS 911 business. And that one was also not so much predicated on capitalization as much as we had worked over the last 5 years to really establish a strong market dominance position. And what was happening in the space that we were in was the space was changing and moving into what's known collectively today as next generation 911. And the movement predicated us to look at the landscape and say, hey, we just spent the last 5 years growing this business into the existing space. What's going to be the best way to move it forward into the new space? And is there some potential maybe to take some of this money off the table and pocket some of the hard work that we've done and yet hitch our wagon to someone that can then grow us into this next generation space? That was a big, strong driver in moving us forward with the sale of the company. And we ended up hitching our wagon to a pretty strong player in that market who continues today to be one of the bigger players there.
And in your example, and I was part of that transaction, so I can speak to it, there were some unique aspects to the ECATS 911, and that's Emergency Call Tracking System is the acronym there. And some of those things were, the vast majority of our customer contracts were multi-year, up to 7 years long. Yeah. And we had recurring revenue that was just, a lot of times pre-funded all 7 years up front. Can you speak to some of those attributes that made ECATS so valuable and had the great multiples it got?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say the biggest one, you touched on it, was the recurring revenue. In the space that we occupied, which was the 911 public safety space, and the niche that we carved out for ourselves, which was the analytics aspect of that space, most companies operated in a per contract type operations model. So they'd go out, they'd either sell a piece of hardware or they'd sell some type of telephony service. And these were, fire and forget type deals. So granted, they would be shaped pretty large, but there was no recurring revenue coming in from there. So companies, would be challenged, if you will, to bank a lot of that money, recognize it in certain ways, and they didn't have a regular run rate. When we came onto the scene, we were one of the first businesses to offer a software as a services model for 911 analytics. And it afforded customers in a great way to buy a service, pay a monthly fee, or in the case of some of our larger customers, even pay upfront, but still get that software as a service type model. So fast to market, fast to implementation, and an ongoing service base behind it that was constantly working with them and moving forward with them. This was a total change in the 911 space. Prior to us coming in there, there was no company that did things like we did, where your monthly fee got you regular updates, regular contacts. You had a service-based organization behind it offering customization, system changes, not in a traditional contract model of schedule, scope, and budget, but more, hey, we're paying this monthly fee, we'd like to get some of this. And that SaaS model really helped drive the business valuation forward, because potential acquirers would look at us and go, holy smoke, they have this large customer base of major customers, and the revenue's reoccurring, and it's subscription based, which really led to a high multiplier when we finally decided to go ahead and build a book and bring it out to market.
So Chris, I'm curious, you talked a little bit about your motivations for selling. Take the group through that process for you. How did it come about? Who did you talk to? How long did it take? Like, what's the psychology around landing at a decision, either individually or collectively, to sell a business?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like any business, you're never alone. And I had a most amazing ownership and board of directors. And so working with that team, as we looked back over our 5-year history and looked forward down the road of where we wanted to go next, the discussions that we started to have were, are we going to go through another round of capitalization? How do we want to build out into this new environment? Because the 911 landscape that we were part of was going through a huge transformation at the time. In fact, it's still going through that transformation. But at the time when we were really looking to how are we going to hit the next round, we were at the pinnacle of that transformation, and we knew in order to participate in the next round of growth that the industry was going to go through, we needed to make a decision collectively as a group. Again, this is the board and the ownership of do we want to kind of start back where we were 5 years ago, or do we want to take what we have and bring it to market and look to join forces with some of the players that are actually going to also go through that transformation and together be stronger to really start to dominate the next set of that market space. As we had those conversations, the general consensus was, look, we built something pretty good and pretty amazing. The market's responded to it. We have great market partnerships. Let's, as an experiment, start to build a little book and just put some feelers out there and see what type of interest the market might have. And if that market interest is significant enough, let's go forward with the full process and see if we can't hitch our wagon with somebody that can take us to the next level.
That's a perfect segue to the next step of the process, which is prepare to sell. And for us and most privately held firms, typically you hire an advisor, a broker, or an investment banker, or you can try and do it yourself, although that's very distracting and if you're also running your business. So we chose to select a banker, and I think we've discussed some of the same attributes in prior podcasts, but typically we would reach out to 3 to 10 different firms. And what we were really looking for here with respect to ECATS in this particular sale is someone that really knew the public safety market and business. And what we found after canvassing folks from all over the United States, there was really only one person that really had great relevant experience. And that's who we went with. I'm curious, Chris, how do you feel like, how do they add value in your perspective?
Yeah, I thought they added value in a couple different ways. And, having that public safety experience was definitely a plus. And they had that coupled with the understanding of software as a service. And even that group understood, wow, here's a software as a service business in a traditional space that really doesn't do software as a service. And they had this understanding of that space. And by an understanding, what we refer to is the 911 space is a government space, but it's also a little different from your traditional government space in that it also operates in some ways almost like, private industry, if you will. There's a very fast, rapid need in that industry for an adoption of technologies and adoption of moving forward. Yet the eye is always on the prize, and the prize is public safety and making sure that they can deliver, when you dial 911, that there's an operator on the other end of that call to hear your 911 call and send the help where it's needed. The group that we chose had already worked with people in that space, different vendors in that space. So they understood the landscape from the perspective of where we fit in the landscape itself, as well as where we complemented other technology providers in that space to really give us an opportunity to get in front of the right potential buyers who could see synergies with joining forces with us and creating something greater than just the two parts alone.
So you talked a little bit, Chris, about a book, preparing a book for the process. And that, as we know, is a big part of what the investment bankers do on the front end. Tell us a little bit about your experience with that. How involved were you? What did that process look and feel like to you?
That I think was one of the most fun parts to do. And the reason why I found so much fun in that was, running the business day to day, you're really deep in the numbers, you're deep in the strategy, you're always looking out for making sure all your employees are taken care of, making sure that the sales are coming in, running the numbers and make sure everything balances out. But getting the book together allows you to kind of take this step back view of your organization, and you see it not just through your eyes, but even through the eyes of the bankers of, hey, you have these pieces and these pieces, and they really help you compartmentalize all the different value pieces of your organization, see each piece for what it contributes to your overall valuation, and really give it an appreciation for the work that your team's been doing over the last 5, 10, however many years you've been in business, and helping you quantify the value of everybody's contribution within the organization until you end up with this wonderful picture from the sales and marketing side to the delivery and operations side to the customer service side and eventually up to the C-suite side. But overall, sitting down and doing that without the guidance of a group that really understood what buyers are looking for, especially in the space that you're looking to sell to, I think would be almost impossible, because at that point you'd kind of be just taking guesses instead of having that expertise and guidance that you need to really hit the target directly. That skill they brought to the table and that understanding of our market, our service based, and then helping us deep dive inside the business itself was really valuable to building a book that told the right story from inception to market growth, to market penetration, to sales strategy, to sales planning, through to delivery, and then through to customer care at the end of it, because things don't end just once you close the sale, especially in our business. That sales closed, we're with that customer through the life of that contract. And the hand is never not held with those customers all the way through, which was a big part of our business model. Customer service was very important to us, and it was a unique characteristic of how we did business with the 911 industry.
Yeah,
I think your point, Chris, about how an investment banking firm will help you narrow in on what your value creators are is super helpful, even if you don't do a deal. Casey and I have been through, engagements with investment bankers that didn't culminate in a sale, but we now have a roadmap of what buyers in the space that we're playing in consider valuable to the business we're talking about. And you can use that strategically going forward to say, hey, we're going to build a plan around the things that we now know from experts in that market are value drivers and value creators. Value creators. It's massively helpful.
Yeah, go ahead, Case.
I was going to say, what we're really talking about here, in my view, is the internal due diligence that we invest in heavily. I think we engaged with investment banker in October 2016. We really didn't start putting the book together until we had completed 2016. So it was almost a year. I think we started in January and we ended in November. And what the point I wanted to add is you got to nail your numbers. You got to be ready to go deep and specific. You have to update financials and forecasts along the way. Very importantly, you have to identify the devaluing aspects of the deal. For example, heavy customer concentration, legal or tax issues, leadership, wanting to leave, et cetera. And then it always comes down to, is it a stock or an asset purchase? So those are some of the aspects that we were dealing with at that same time as well. Is there anything that you could, for Peter or Dexler, is there anything that you would have changed to that process, or maybe just learnings?
I don't think there's anything I really would have changed during the process. I think it was really enlightening to learn through. One of the things I'd encourage anybody who's going through this process is at the end of that process, you might see an opportunity to grow your business even further. And maybe selling now, while you could get a great valuation, would make sense. That real internal look, and especially the building of the book, can open up opportunities that could further your valuation if you held off a year or two and made an investment into that area and that space. I can remember once we finished all of that due diligence and all of our internal due diligence, there were some long discussions, with everybody, with the board and the ownership of, hey, we have all this new insight and data. Do we really want to move forward with this now? Because we could do X, Y, or Z and maybe see these numbers down the road. And our consensus was we saw the market itself was evolving into a next generation type world. And the decision that we had made was, it's going to make most sense for all parties involved, the employees as well as the ownership, if we can find a synergistic group to join forces with and really come into the market in a much stronger way than we had done it alone for the last 6 years.
Yeah. That kind of leads into Act 2, which is, going to market. We've done the work, we've prepared the documents, we're ready to go. And a clear benefit of having an investment banker who knows the space and knows who the potential buyers are really helps us to pick the type of process we're going to run to, get people involved in this auction process. There's many different types. There's closed and limited lists of potential buyers. There's a shotgun approach where you just kind of spray and pray. There's a hybrid of the two. They all really funnel down at the end of the day to a handful. Ultimately, you would like to have at least 3 competitive buyers to pick one. And then along the way, I recall, Dexter, that we did, I think, something along the lines of 31-hour phone or Zoom type meetings just to present what we had done to that point. What are your recollections about that effort, Dexter?
Yeah, I truly remember all that. And early on in our conversation here, I mentioned that the 911 industry is unique. Well, I shouldn't say unique, is like any other industry. There's multiple providers. But if you think about what happens in the 911 space, if you will, and again, I'm not talking police and fire as much as I'm talking the people at the end when you dial 911, the technologists are broken up into certain silos. You have kind of the radio technologists, you have the call handling technologists, you have the recording technologists and the mapping technologists, and all those vendors and technologies come together at the 911 center to give that situational awareness for a call handler to be able to do what it is that they do. Working with the investment bank that we worked with, they had contacts and understood each one of those different silos and how our business complemented each one of the major carriers in one of those silos. And so throughout that 30 or more set of conversations, we were talking with everybody in the industry who knew us, because we weren't an unknown entity in the industry. We had already worked with almost all 30 of the players that we had spoken with. So that helped a lot of the conversation, because a lot of the people we spoke with, I had already had personal relationships with, and a lot of the companies had already known a way that there was a synergy between our business and their business. And so getting into those conversations with them, the majority of those times were taken really painting the picture of, this is what we do, you kind of know us, but here's how we can all work as one cohesive unit. I can remember some of those conversations going 2-3 hours as we'd really go deep into synergies and ways that the businesses could complement each other, technologies that they had that they wanted to see in mixed with our technologies, and the ones that really were forward thinking, if you will, in terms of seeing the next gen of how the space was moving, really understood the way that both companies could increase each other's value throughout the course of those interviews. I think they lasted.
And Chris, remember, there's one aspect that kind of threw us for a loop a little bit, which was many of the calls lined up with the IBMs and the bigger players like the business, but we were just too small. And that was sort of like a moment of, wow, yeah, that's kind of hard to hear. But if it's under 20 million top line revenue, they just don't want to spend the time. It's not that they don't like it. They want to go after a $500 million deal.
Yep. One of our biggest resellers that really knew our technology actually was like that. We approached them and they're like, well, we know you guys, we totally get your business. You actually could fold into our portfolio, but you don't move the needle. And since we didn't move the needle, they told us good luck on everything you're doing. We're looking forward to continuing to work with you no matter what happens. But yeah, Casey, to your point, some of those larger organizations that we worked with, if you didn't move the needle, and especially if they were publicly traded, if that acquisition didn't create shareholder value that could be measured in terms of how it would move their stock price up, even if you were the best match for their portfolio, there was no business interest because it couldn't bring them the valuations they were looking for in terms of providing shareholder value that could be measured by that acquisition.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that a $20 million deal and a $500 million deal take about the same amount of effort and time, right? And so they're balancing priorities, and they're saying, just as you said, Chris, this one moves the needle and this one doesn't. I mean, I have n number of resources to do this. I'm going to pick the one that moves it.
Yep.
Was there anything in those? I mean, I remember you being on call after call after call and just wind Chris up and let him go, and he talks to everybody, and you did a phenomenal job. Was there any series of questions or issues that you saw that sort of surprised you didn't see coming, at least initially, or was a common theme that was different than you thought?
The thing I think that surprised me more than anything was how much of a backseat the technology that we had took to the overall conversations. The focus was on, sales plans, sales numbers, sales execution, all totally critical, but nobody really ever seemed to have a strong eye on, okay, if we acquire you, how do we fold you into our technological ecosystem? And while that doesn't sound like it should be something that should occupy a major part of the time, if you do close the deal, there's a part of that happens, which is known as integration, when you really go through it. And not asking those questions early on by the acquirer, made it easier for us because we really didn't have to, take them through our entire technology stack and explain how everything works. But once things started to move forward, and especially post-acquisition, not having those questions up front can really create a challenge for the acquirer, only in that they may not have the right complementary infrastructure for what you're doing.
Yeah.
The other side of it had to do with the way we were doing our sales. We were heavily invested in channel-based sales as well as direct sales. And again, an acquirer needs to have an understanding of how do your sales and your sales methodologies work with the way they currently do sales and sales methodologies. Because if they decide to implement their sales methodologies into your business that totally derails what's made you successful, they're basically going to derail their own investment because you were successful from the way you were selling and the channels you were working with and the methods that you were using. And it surprised me how little they even asked those questions. Again, the interest was, how big are your pipelines? What is your close rate? What is your 2 to 3 year sales pipeline and plan look like, without really looking into what is your sales methodology? How does it work if we introduce you into our sales methodology that does it this way? What would be the challenges that may be faced by your own team after acquisition if we change things this other way?
Yeah.
And those were really surprising to me, that questions of those natures from an integration standpoint, as well as a sales methodology standpoint, never really came up. Again, I think because the focus was more on how are you going to add to our top line? How do we integrate your revenues? How do we make sure that our investment in you returns an ROI to us? And I felt most of the questions always centered from their perspective around that, which I was only happy to answer. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking bigger picture. I'm like, if you buy, what about all these other things? And of course, it's always a game of chess. And so you don't want to spoon feed them questions for them to ask you. But at the same time, I have a protective instinct for my team and my staff. So I want to make sure anywhere that acquires us, we as the family that we were, would have been taken care of, and make sure that we're moving into an environment that, at least is complementary from a cultural fit. And the other things that they didn't ask about, we can work through post-acquisition.
Yeah.
So
And
that's
as we
that's
push,
go ahead, Casey.
go ahead, Peter.
I was just going to say that's a good segue to, when we're in the middle of this process, Chris, and, you mentioned thinking about employees and thinking about integration. This is, as a seller, it's as much about vetting your buyer as it is about them vetting you, right?
Absolutely.
You as a seller, yes,
Absolutely.
you have that right to say, I want to work with this group. I don't want to work with this group. Tell us a little bit about how you managed that, sort of vetting the various buyers and what factors you considered. And then I'd also like to hear just a little bit about how you manage the employee base, because no matter how confidential it might be, stuff gets out and people get distracted. And the invariable question is, what does this mean to me? So how did you manage those two things?
Yeah, that was a challenging area for sure. I would say the biggest challenge that I faced with your first question in understanding the cultural fit of any buyer is, at the end of the day, we were always a small shop. We started with a group of 4 or 5 people. We ended on acquisition at around 42, and everybody knew everybody else. And we ran the organization very, very flat. Sure, there was a developer here and maybe a customer service person over here, so they didn't necessarily be able to do each other's jobs, but everybody knows everybody else. We played as hard as we worked. We all worked together as a family. So for us, culture in any acquirer had to allow us to maintain our cohesion with each other, as well as becoming part of the larger group that would acquire us. A lot of the questions, that I would ask, usually it would be on the second or third go round with these companies after we got through a couple rounds of vetting, really started hitting on more of their culture and how them as a business would integrate us into their current corporate culture, or if they were a small business, what does it mean to have our, flat organization type environment in your type environment, and getting an understanding from them of how the employees would be taken care of. Because once you sell, at the end of the day, you're no longer in control. The business now is owned and operated by somebody else. Even if you're still part of it, you're now reporting to a different set of rules, a different set of governance, if you will. And you got to be aware of how that governance will eventually impact your employees. I was very conscious of that, especially with some of the larger organizations that we had spoken to. And definitely there was concern in some of them that, the cultural fit here may not work for the employees to be successful. And quite frankly, if the employees didn't go along with it, the business would collapse, because you're not just buying a technology or a product, especially with a SaaS-based business. You're buying the people that make it happen and the people that make it operate. And if the people who make it operate aren't 100% behind it, you basically lost the skeletal structure that keeps that body alive, and you end up with a blob of parts that just fall apart.
Pause there for a second. How did you determine who the 2 or 3 key executives were? And for the audience, this usually means these key employees are specifically written into the deal structure, such that if they leave, there's some kind of penalty or forfeiture. So you have to be very careful about who you choose, make sure they want to go, and keep them there for the 2-year period or whatever the minimum period to stay is.
Yeah, so within the group that we were, again, we were at peak 42 people. There were a few key individuals that were identified as those that were the glue for their individual teams. Some were managers, some were just hardcore contributors that maybe never made it up to the management level, but their relationship with existing customers was so critical that they needed to be named as critical assets within the scope and shape of the deal, because if they had left, it would have made customers fearful that the acquisition that just occurred is something that represents an end of everything as you know it, which would have seen an exodus of customers. Again, consider we were a SaaS. Software as a service implies that at any moment in time, they can stop their subscription. So even while the customer may have a contract with you, the truth being the contracts were only as good as the monthly service fees that were coming in. And for those customers that didn't prepay, it's very easy for them to just say, we're not going to pay anymore. And they've just stopped being a customer, and we have no recourse in one way or the other to claw that back. So making sure that our customer care people who were involved at a certain level with those folks were taken care of. We identified key individuals there. And my operations and delivery staff identified their own folks within their groups that they felt were key. And so it was selective is probably the wrong word, but it was a process that went through the leadership channels. So we had a small leadership team that ran it. They were identified as key stakeholders. And then from within their organizations, they identified folks that represented the key stakeholders that we needed to maintain during the integration after acquisition process to give the market the security that nothing's going to change, everything's the same. We've just hitched our wagon up to somebody who's going to make it even bigger and better than what you've ever seen before.
And of course, you were one of those people that went with.
Absolutely. No, there was no hesitation on my part to see it through. It was a unique experience for sure. And I never could have considered not doing it. As a big practitioner, I practice what I preach. It would have made no sense not to go with the organization and sit behind, because it would have flown in the face of our entire culture.
Yeah. So was there anything, Chris, during the deal, were there any points during the deal where you were like, this isn't going to happen? Or I don't know if we can make this, if we can get to the finish line. Were there certain key points in the transaction where that happened, and what were they?
Yeah, for sure. There were multiple aspects of it. But one of the things that I'd like to do before I answer that is kind of go back to the second part of your question, Pete. You had asked, how did you not let information slip out to create anxiety among the staff and really not disrupt your day-to-day? Because at the end of the day, as a small business, everybody thinks, oh, we're going to sell, and oh my gosh, am I going to get my windfall? Those are huge distractions for the employee base. Yeah. We did a pretty good job, I believe, and actually post-mortem after the acquisition, we did a fantastic job of really keeping things confidential. The challenge sometimes was we'd have to ask staff members for information that we'd never asked them before. And that would raise a question like, wow, you've never asked me for this piece of information before. What's going on? But the managers who knew what was going on and understood the process we were going through did a very, very good job of not letting the cat out of the bag until we got to a point where it was okay for people to know. And that point really started to arrive when the acquirer decided, we know the executives, we need to start meeting some of the people in the trenches. And the moment that decision point is hit, you're going to start losing control of the hiding, if you will. But up until that point, the team had done a really, really good job of talking amongst themselves. And I think that's a key point. Anybody involved in this, as managers, we know, managers talk to other managers because we need groups that we can vent to and talk with. And during an acquisition, you need that core team to know that they can talk freely amongst themselves so they can get their fears, their anxieties, their excitement out in a way that resonates with somebody else who's going through it. I might come home and talk to my wife about what's going on, but she can't relate to me, say, the same way as my director of operations can, who's right there going through it and seeing what could change and having the anxiety of what could change for them. And being able to express that in a way that would resonate with somebody who could relate to that. From an emotional and psychological perspective, that's such a big part of the M&A process. And I'm thankful that our board and our ownership, gave me that sounding board to be able to vent those, which takes me to the answer to your current question, which is, were there times that you were like, man, what's going on? And yeah, there were plenty of times going through the process where, I would start to have doubts of, do we really want to go through with this? I mean, if we do this, all this work that we've done over the last 6-7 years is going to maybe be changed and be different. How will we be perceived in the market? Do I want to work with a different set of ownership and a different group who may not really understand, what we did, what we're going through, how we're going to be successful? Those challenges definitely reared their heads. But when you looked at the bigger picture and reflected on how good it would be for all the employees involved, for the organization, for the ownership, as well as yourself. I mean, come on, let's be honest. Everybody wants to make a buck in these things. Those outweighed the concerns. And the most important part to me was I knew the employee base would be taken care of. And that moving into any new environment, no matter whose it was, everybody had a home, and there was never a conversation with any of the finalists of, well, how are we going to trim your staff to work you into here? And the fact that we never had conversations like that really gave me confidence with the finalists that we picked the right finalists to actually hitch our wagon to.
Yep. And as I recall, what also helped assuage a lot of those concerns was that towards the end of our process, I believe it was picked 5 companies. I think there were 3 strategics and 2 PEs, and they flew in over a 3-day period. Some stayed, I think 3 of the 5 stayed for dinner and stayed overnight for a couple times. And that process was unique in that I think that was the first time we introduced the key employees to some of these buyers. And it was the first time some of those potential acquirers brought in more of their staff and key leaders. And we had, I think they were half-day sessions. And for some of them, we had a big dinner kind of celebration after each day. And that's when you really got to know who these folks were, what their culture was like. What are your recollections of that whole process?
Yeah, I think that's a critical part as you're getting towards the finish line, because there's one thing to play it close to the vest during the courtship, if you will. It's another thing to socialize with these individuals who you're going to be working with over a long period of time, and get the feeling of, can we have a professional as well as pseudo-personal relationship, and is there chemistry there between all of us and the ability to work? Those dinners were critical for that, because a lot of times defenses are lowered a little bit when you're in a more social setting, and you get a chance to meet these people for who these people really are, and especially seeing how they interact with your own staff, and are they being respectful to them no matter where they sit maybe in the hierarchy. Are they caring about what the people are speaking to? Are they listening to the concerns that the team has as they bring it up? And not just in the interview process, but in the social setting as well, seeing, conversations of, are they being, honest with, when they're asked a personal question, they're answering that personal question. They're letting themselves, to a certain extent, be vulnerable to, a penetrating or a probing question. Those behaviors really help cement the comfort of who we were eventually going to hitch our wagon to.
Well, I also think it helps get the transaction done. Like, if I compare the 2 deals we did that year, we spent a lot more time vetting the potential buyers in the ECATS deal than we did in the other deal. And it manifested itself in the way the negotiations went, because the negotiations in the ECATS deal were not contentious. Yeah. And because we knew that we could go to the other side and say, hey, this is what we're trying to accomplish. We understand, let's get to a common goal. Let's get to a common set of language to get there. And we could do that fairly easily. Whereas in the other one, we didn't have that relationship, and it just made it harder.
Yeah, I agree that things went real smooth once we got to the money questions. Really, that at the end of the day, that's what the final bid is what are you going to offer? How are we going to shape it? How are the employees going to be taken care of? Those went very smooth.
I would offer as well that the acquirer who won that, won the deal to acquire ECATS is someone we'd been talking to on and off for years. And so we knew going through this process that there was a high likelihood that this same acquirer would probably move mountain and earth to make sure they got ECATS because it completed their tech stack and their offering. And what helped tremendously by doing this process was there were a couple other really interesting strategic buyers that we very nearly went with, but it helped to create a better deal and outcome for us from the original acquirer who had always wanted to win our business.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I mentioned earlier in the space, there's, kind of certain tiers of technical vendor. We were working with call handling vendors who were a finalist. We were working with recording vendors that were a finalist, and we were working with mapping vendors that were a finalist. And each one, there was great compelling reasons to go with each one of those finalists. But yeah, to your point, Casey, the acquirer who eventually got us, we had already started working in a small way with integrating their platform in a way that upon acquisition would only get tighter and would only get deeper. So it definitely helped that we had already had good working relationships with those folks, as well as a lot of personal relationships across that organization.
I was just going to say, so as we sort of transition from Act 2 to Act 3 being the deal's done, right? We've negotiated it. We've gone from LOI to definitive documents. We've signed the definitive documents. We've got money in the bank. It's over, but it's not. And I think, Chris, your experience and your team's experience is super instructive here because, as you said earlier, you went with the deal. And that's good until it's not, or until it might not be. And I think your experience and your team's experience is super interesting here. Touch on, if you mind, just touch on that a little bit. What was it like? Did you pick the right one? Do you feel like you picked the right one, or maybe not?
Sure. Yeah. Hindsight's always 20/20, and I'm a little torn 50/50, knowing who the finalists were, what things might have been had we chosen one of the other organizations. I think for me and for the team, probably the biggest shock to the system, if you will, is you hear about corporate America and what it means to work for a billion-dollar publicly traded company. And a lot of us, when I would meet with the team as we were getting closer, we're thinking, no, it can't be like these cliche things that we hear about where, in order to, even get, a door open, you've got to fill out 12 different forms and go through these different processes. And yet those exist in the corporate world. And that was probably the biggest shock to the system that everybody had, was things that used to be very quick and easy that we could pivot on a dime with. Suddenly now we're burdened down in process that existed because we were acquired by a billion-dollar publicly traded entity. And they have rules and procedures and processes in place across their organization that they have to follow to maintain their legal standing, especially at the time as a publicly traded company, that really impacted, how our normal day-to-day would be. As a simple example, when we needed to hire pre-acquisition, we simply looked at our organization and said, what skill set do we need to bring in right now? And we would build a job description for that skill set. We would put it into our hiring queue and bring in exactly the resource that we needed with the job description that we wanted. Post-acquisition, we could no longer do that. We had to look through an existing set of job description templates pick the one that as much closely matched what we were really looking for, then go out to the market with that. And as people would come in through the interview process, we had an opportunity to vet them, but we could never specify skill sets like we could in the past. And so it became a lot more challenging to hire the right resource for the roles that we wanted, because the corporate's structure of job description, as an example, didn't exist in exactly the way that we needed to fill the skill set that we had the need for. And so those were real big shocks. When I introduced myself early on, I skimmed through my pedigree. Really, I've been an entrepreneur since I was a young man, and I love the speed at which small and nimble businesses can grow and turn on a dime and react to market forces and react to market needs, and not really having to go through 4 layers of bureaucracy, be vetted by all these different individuals who may or may not even understand your business, but have to check a box because this is the way the organization operates. Moving into a world like that, not just for me, but for the entire staff, it was a big change. What surprised me the most, I think, was how about half the staff seemed to thrive with that much structure and that much overhead on them, versus some of us that struggled a little bit with that because we wanted to move fast, go fast, do things quickly. And it was neat to see that dichotomy bring itself forward, because they'd always been living in a go fast, hair on fire kind of environment. And that's what got us into the market position that we were in. But then being indoctrinated into a corporate structure, which for some folks presented them with opportunities we just could never present. Again, as a small organization, our employees' upward mobility and lateral mobility were limited by the size of the org that we were. But once we got acquired, for many of them, there were suddenly upward and lateral opportunities available in totally different divisions and different business units of the acquirer's business that they could then move into. And some took advantage of that and moved into other aspects of that organization and furthered their career that way, which is a great opportunity for them. And I'm really excited to see that they were able to do that. But again, for some of us, not having that nimble flexibility and the ability to do what's right for the organization as quickly as possible without having to go through months of vetting was really a kind of a punch to the face, if you will, and a shock of, wow, this is so much different than what we've been used to over the last 5-6 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Pete, you have any other questions for Chris as we're getting short on time?
Yeah, I think we're getting pretty short on time. I mean, I guess the only other question, Chris, and you touched on this a little bit, is they didn't ask much about the tech stack going through the process.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the output of that after the lights went down? Can't imagine it was probably all rosy.
It really wasn't. Within the first 6 months after acquisition, the IT services group began the process of what probably should have been done during the due diligence phase, which was understanding what the tech stack was, how it integrates with their organization. And what they found was, wow, this tech stack, while is great for what their business does and what their business operates against, it's totally a 180 from the tech stack that they already had. So they were staring down the barrel of either a complete platform rewrite, which really wouldn't have made any sense in order to integrate that into their existing tech stack, or looking at forklifting the tech stack we had and moving that into their data environment, or looking at a way to say, well, let's just keep the tech stack where it is and maintain it in its existing stack, in its existing hardware, its existing infrastructure, its existing cloud services, and over time look to retool it. I think they took the third option there, and over time now they're looking to rebuild, retool, and redesign things. But it really was an eye opener for them, what really was in that technological stack and how different a corporate tech world was from the kind of tech stack a small business who is a SaaS-based business with a cloud infrastructure can operate. because the two were very, very different. You think of traditional corporate tech stacks and corporate environments, and they definitely were that. Whereas when you think of small businesses, especially in today's world, operating in a cloud-based environment, some as sophisticated as serverless environments, although we were not, it is a big difference between that and having racks in a closet, and the licenses that goes with it, and the organizational expertise that goes with that are two different types of expertise. And that really, I think, threw them a little bit for a loop when they finally sat down and ran the numbers and went, that's an interesting conundrum that we have created for ourselves in terms of how do we appropriately integrate the tech stack and make sure things operate the same. Not only was the tech stack a challenge, we went through multiple rounds of accounting changes when they acquired us. We had a certain model that we used for revenue recognition, both once an ECAT sale closed versus when an ECAT sale was moving month to month. We had a startup fee and a monthly fee, and we had a different accounting way of recognizing that revenue. When we got acquired, they changed the way we recognize revenue. Then they went back to the way we recognized our revenue, and then they went back to the way they wanted to recognize revenue. And that happened within, I would say, an 18-month period of this kind of back and forth from their accounting perspective of how best to recognize the way the ECAT's business unit would bring money into the organization. And, I think that put a lot of stress and strain on the accounting group, because it was a little different than what their traditional model was, as we've talked earlier on in the conversation, kind of the fire and forget sale, where you're making a big deal right up front for X hardware, that goes out the door, and there's not really a monthly recurring against that service. There's a service contract, which is totally different from a subscription contract for the entire service. And that was another pain point, I would say, after acquisition that we really had to overcome the hurdle on, was the accounting side.
Yep, that's my space, and I understand that. But hey, Chris, to wrap it up, you've been an amazing guest. Obviously, we went through this journey together, and all in all, it was very impactful, very successful, and I thank you for coming and sharing your experiences. And
my pleasure. It's always fun. Let me know if you want to talk again.
Well, we may get you on a guest cameo for one of our webinars down the road, Chris. So appreciate your time. Appreciate the participants' time. And next month we've got one in June 24th? Is that right? June 24th. How to create value. And we touched on that a little bit today as it relates to investment banking, but we're going to go deeper into that next time. So
awesome. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks all.
Take it easy.